After e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6 and bishop e5, Rossolimo is on the board, and after d6, white takes the knight, pawn takes back, and then e5. So in this variation, we're going back to when we're looking at d5, and then the next move is d3. And in the first two videos, we went through always bishop g4 and so on. What happens when the game is closed immediately, which is a very popular option. But this has to be punished in a very specific way, right? It's very accurate. b3, and the bishop will be going to target the pawn in c5 together with the knight. So two options we're going to be looking at: knight e7 with then going to f5 and then g6, or bishop e7. Bishop in g7 is wrong because it just abandons the pawn in c5 forever, and also it will give problems to the black player to castle. So let's have a look at it quickly actually. g6, which is not good, it also creates weakness on the dark squares. Knight c3, white's already evaluated like +2, which is insane if you think about it. But also, black will have a very ugly bishop, this one, and this bishop will be useless. Bishop g7, and then very normal moves like castling, and now black will have to play the knight. So let's say knight to e7 in order to castle. Knight a5, the idea is to take the pawn immediately. So if black castles, white goes a clean pawn up, and then eventually plays a move like d4, and it's just so much better. Computer evaluates as if white was white a piece, because not only is just the pawn advantage, but it's also much better position, and we all can tell why. So if black plays this move, this is a pattern to remember: c4. Now you just take the pawn, and your upper pawn development is just going to be amazing. And if black takes it, then of course this is going to be a disaster, because queen takes, king takes, rook check, bishop can't block because the knight is going to put pressure on it, and it's going to be game over. The king moves back, but now the king doesn't have access to this square, can't castle anymore, and knight c5 is coming anyway, with the idea of going knight e4 and become a super strong knight. And position here is completely won for white. It's like, I think it's like +5 or something. So let's make a recap. Knight to c6 actually, and d6, then check, pawn takes back, and e5, d5, d3, and this is the variation where they play e6 early. So b3 is the move to continue. So let's also mention now that bishop e7 is not the ideal. So bishop g7 is no good, bishop e7 is no good either, because it blocks this knight, and now white will play knight to c3 immediately. There's no need to put this bishop already here, because we need to see what black does. In this variation that I'm offering, also because the black bishop can't move anywhere without being taken, or without losing tempos, and in this variation black decided to play bishop e7, so he's going to have to play knight h6 to develop, and this can be taken, and then pawn takes back, and now castle. It looks like that is doable because of rook g8. It looks like black isn't too bad, but how do we punish this setup? Queen to c1 now, going for the pawn in h6, and the queen will reach such square. Also the knight is defending, and from h6 the queen will have access to h7 and so on. So white is much more comfortable here. Let's have a look at this move, which could be a counter attack idea that I've encountered personally a few times, just to stop the arrival of the queen so close to the opponent king side and start cleaning stuff. So this is taken, and then queen takes, and I think the queen takes is the best move, and the reason is that in such a close endgame, and with a few tempos that white is winning, white should be winning the endgame. This is due to the fact that the pawn in c5 will be taken no matter what. So knight a4 will win the pawn, and pushing c4 doesn't help. If pawn takes back in g5, black is closing the file of the rook, which is bad, and then knight a4, white will play the endgame with an advantage. Evaluate is pretty much like 250, and there is absolutely nothing for black. After knight reaches the square c5, the black player will not even be able to ever kick it out with a pawn, so the knight will be sitting there forever. In this variation that I'm going to be going through, what happens after rook to g5, because it comes with an attack on the pawn, this is met by f4, and after rook to g7, the rook can go to f3, finding its way to development. This bishop will never be effective on the square h3. So after the the typical pattern move. It's kind of typical to see this bishop a6 move in this Rossolimo. White continues with knight a4, going for the pawn. And now let's have a look at this scenario, which is when they push c4 with the support of the bishop. So there's quite a lot of support on c4. White now continues with knight c5, so nothing to worry. It comes with an attack on the bishop. Bishop b5 doesn't work because of a4, winning the game. And the other option will be bishop to c8. And now that means that this idea of bishop a6 to protect the square c4 for black doesn't work, because knight c5 kicks it away, and now the pawn can finally take. And after pawn takes back, white finishes development with rook to d1. Black has an isolated pawn and a not very good bishop on c8. Taking in b3 will just help the white player, of course. So if pawn takes, then a takes back. It's the best way to continue. Whereas if instead a5 comes, white can even afford to take the pawn in c4, and after bishop a6, which is one of the reasons why a5 was played, so the rook protects it. Now rook to d4, protecting the pawn. And the reason why even pieces that are so unflexible like the rooks can be placed in the center of the board to defend pawns clearly indicates how black has no mobility. After king to e7 seems to be making sense. Let's just go on like a couple more moves. Rook f to d3 should win the game. And even if the king hadn't gone to e7, played something else, white will still be able to double up the rooks. This rook will never be able to abandon the bishop, because then the bishop will be taken. So yeah, white's completely winning. Let's go back from the start. So take the knight, pawn takes back, e5, d5, d3, and now e6, the closed variation. So b3 is the move, and let's have a look at this, because this is probably the most serious variation of all of them. Knight e7 seems to be making more sense, and then the bishop will go to e7 without blocking the knight, and then the knight will reach these squares, which are kind of common in this French type of structure. So knight e7 is met by knight to c3. Now the two main options will be knight f5, knight g6. Let's start with knight g6. The knight puts pressure on e5 and potentially can go to f4. Definitely not now, but later on. White now continues with the thematic knight a4, attacking the pawn. The pawn is still defended. So after bishop e7 and castle, and then castle, and rook e1, it looks like white hasn't achieved anything, but still, this pawn is going to be a target forever. So the most passive variation, let's say for example rook e8 now, white will continue with bishop a3, putting two attackers over the pawn c5. And if black were to play passive like queen to a5, which basically puts another defender on the square c5 and also stops the knight from moving, is pinning it. So now the best move is queen to d2. We're looking for a swap. And after the swap has occurred, then yes, we will take control of the center and win material. A material that in such a close game is good enough to go for a win. So let's have a look at instead this idea, which is what happens when, so from this position after knight a4, what happens what happens with this? When they play this move, which I used to find very annoying, there's so much pressure on e5, and this could be a chance for black to have more control over the center. Bishop b2 is the best move. Of course, a move like d4 to block the bishop is not advisable, because we've talked about it extensively in the first game, in the first video of this series of how to beat the Rossolimo d6, because of the long-term weaknesses on the central squares. So let's see what happens when they take the pawn. Knight takes back. This knight is sitting gloriously in e5, so after take, the game is compromised. White will win. It looks like, black has got the bishop pair. It looks like a completely normal game. So why does the engine evaluate it as if white was up a piece? Let's look at this very normal idea, like bishop f6, trying to release the pressure, and also eliminating the bishop that is in the same color as the weakest pawn, the one that we're going to take and develop material advantage. Best move now is queen d2. So in case of take, then white will be able to double up the rooks, and black will no longer have the dark square bishop, which is the good one, and white will be putting a lot of pressure on the square e6, and black will be left with this silly bishop. So after queen e7, which seems to be guarding the square in c5, how to capitalize this? Queen c3, and yeah. So if instead from this position, if instead of bishop f6, black plays bishop d6, then again queen d2. The idea, of course, it's a possibility, of course, to be able to. The idea, of course, is, it's a possibility to go and put pressure on c5, but it depends on what black does as well. So again, take is the same thing as before. White will just go to a much better endgame, better pieces for such type of structure. After queen to c7, let's have a look at this scenario. White continues with queen to e3. And now again, there is pressure and the possibility to take, and then take in c5. So what happens in this variation? This is a computer move. Black tries a rook to f5, for instance. White can take in d6. Queen takes back. And now queen takes e5. And now queen to f4. So the idea that what the black can have is to just resign that pawn in c5 and go for an attack. This is simply met by rook e2, and there's just nothing to worry. After bishop b7 defending the pawn, queen e7 is the best move, putting pressure on the square in e6. White is completely winning. Whereas if instead bishop d7, queen e7 will also be coming with an attack on the bishop, so that's kind of the same. It gives birth to a very similar scenario. Again, white's completely winning. So the last scenario we're going to look at is going to be, okay, so Rossolimo, and then take, e5, d5, d3, and e6, closed variation, and now b3. So we are looking at knight e7, knight c3, and earlier we went to knight g6. What happens after knight f5? Well, now simply castle, and then bishop e7, so that black can castle too, and now knight a4. So pretty much same stuff. Black castles, and now bishop a3. Immediately going for the pawn. Black doesn't have a knight in g6 that is putting pressure on e5, so that we don't have to worry about e5. It's completely safe. We can immediately go for the pawn. So that is the slight difference that there is between this variation and the other one. So after a5, white's best thing to do is to give up the pawn in order to get some development. Maybe the rook or the bishop can go out somehow. White goes on with rook to e1. No need to take this pawn right now because it's going to be taken anyway. And now, so for example, if black plays a normal looking move like rook e8, just take the pawn in c5. Black will be left, after swap, black will be left with the bad bishop. Either way, the knight can take back, and this is a solid advantage. If instead of rook e8, black plays c4, in this position, we can't really just take as before because it comes with a discovered attack on the bishop. So this is the last scenario that we needed to look at so that this video is more complete as I could possibly make it. Now simply, as we obviously understand, we take bishop of the black player and then takes back, and now d4, closing the center. Black is left with his tall pawn. Now the white player's idea is to take the pawn in c4, and so basically if white were to move again now, white will play this, take, and then just place the rook in b1, and then play the pawn in c3, holding an excellent center. Black will have this double isolated pawn, and then as soon as the bishop reaches square a6, it can be attacked by the knight. So let's just go on a few moves from this hypothetical scenario. So black's about to just get a very bad pawn structure, so he might as well take, and he kind of has to do it. A takes back, and now if bishop a6 to develop the bishop, knight a5, knight c5, and also let's remember that knight c5 stops the idea of c5 from happening. Knight c5, and now the rook can't move. If the other rook moves, then rook a5 is safe to happen, and if the bishop, instead of developing to a6, goes to b7, then same thing, knight c5, and white has a rook on an open file, and black has no developing chances, right? Because he is left with this piece that is completely useless. Let's have a look at rook defending the bishop. Then this is met by queen to d2, and it's kind of a zugzwang. Black can't move anything without making his position weaker. And now there's two attackers over this square in a5, so that's unstoppable. So if black can't really push the pawn because it gets taken, and yeah, any other move will be met by rook takes, and then the pieces will be piling up on the a file. So if black plays h5 or something like that, with the idea of h4, h3 or something, yeah, rook takes. And in this scenario, like, black will never get rid of the center control because of this monster knight in c5. So a move like f6, for instance, to challenge the strong center of the white player is simply taken, because then there's going to be two attackers over e6.